Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Pendo, and I'm a program manager with the Radiology Leadership Institute. And I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, the first of the RLI Power Hour webinar series. Tonight's topic is on personal leadership. Leading begins with yourself. Please advance the slide, Lori. Thank you. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. See something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right-hand corner. And when you join today's webinar, you selected to join either by phone call or computer audio. If for any reason you'd like to change your selection, you can do so by accessing your audio pane in the control panel. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's presenters. You may do so by typing your questions into the question pane in the control panel. You may send your questions at any time, and we'll collect those and bring them up as soon as we're able to. If you prefer to ask your questions verbally, you may raise your hand using the hand raise icon in the grab tab on the left corner of your control panel. And if you've joined the webinar tonight using your phone, please make sure you enter your PIN number, which is found in the audio pane, so that we may unmute your line and you can ask your question. Please go ahead and advance the slide. I'd also like to take a quick minute to show you the schedule of the remainder webinars for this series. Please note that the next webinar featuring Drs. Samir Patel and Kurt Anzalotti discussing the topic of creating value will be held on Wednesday, October 24th. So mark your calendars. Please flip the slide. And so finally, I'd also like to introduce our organizers and moderators of the webinar series. Dr. Rubin is a professor of radiology and bioengineering at Duke University, but unfortunately he's not able to join us tonight. However, we do have his wonderful co-moderator and co-organizer, Dr. Jennifer Nathan, who assists in, she's the assistant professor of neuroradiology at Johns Hopkins University. And Dr. Nathan, are you introducing or am I doing introductions?
I can do a brief introduction. So first of all, I'd like to, oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
So yeah, first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone on this call to our first topic in the RLI Power Hour series, Personal Leadership, Leading Begins with Yourself. We have two outstanding faculty that will be speaking on this topic this evening. We have Dr. Norbash and Dr. Cannon. If we could go to that next slide then. So Dr. Norbash is professor and chair of radiology at University of California, San Diego, and Dr. Cannon is professor and chair of Department of Radiology at University of Alabama. So I'll now turn things over to you, Dr. Norbash.
Good evening, everyone. Dr. Cannon and I would like to thank the Radiology Leadership Institute for inviting our participation this evening. In way of introduction, I'd like to talk about some assumptions that have led to our choosing this space to have a conversation in. And it has to do with how we perceive leadership and the fact that leadership can be scaled up and it can be scaled down. So how far down can leadership be scaled? Well, there's a concept of personal leadership, and we'll get to that, which is at a small scale, but our expectation, our hope, is that if we learn about leadership at a small scale, we can translate it into a larger scale. And it really focuses on what we think of when we're talking about leadership specifically. We believe that leadership is teachable and learnable. So it could be reduced to being considered a skill. And we can perhaps pick up cues from individuals who are natural leaders who we've encountered and we've seen. And leadership can be applied and derived from examples and situations. So we believe that leadership is teachable and it's learnable. We also believe that leadership principles can be applied to groups that are large or small. And once the principles of leadership are applied, they can be scaled up and they can be scaled down. So let's start with leadership. What are we thinking about when we talk about leadership? Leadership typically refers to that one person who's out ahead and showing the way to others. So it is the state or position of being a leader. Again, how is it that a leader leads? Well, it's possible that the leader is seeing something that others do not see. Or maybe the leader is fearless and is willing to take a risk that others aren't willing to take. Or maybe the leader is adventurous and is an experimentalist and likes to do things, realizing there may be some failure, but there's ultimately growth. So there's this suggestion or expectation that a leader is out front. And so as we talk about leadership, it's important to consider the characteristics that put a leader out front, why that leader is comfortable being out front, and also understanding that to have effective leadership, you also have to have followers. And so it's the nature of a small group and how it is that leaders lead and what it is that they do in terms of imbuing the followers with a sense of direction and with a sense of inspiration that causes the followers to appreciate the leader and to follow the leader. Now, if you really want to scale it down at a very small scale and talk about personal leadership in principle refers to the act of establishing a direction and goal by which one guides oneself. So what that means is having purpose and having direction to what it is that we are doing as individuals, realizing that we have to inspire ourselves, we have to message to ourselves, we have to focus on what's happening in our lives, we have to learn from what's happening around us, we have to project a sense of optimism, we have to create optimism in ourselves and engender it in ourselves. And so as you think about personal leadership and how it is that we as individuals pick a direction, pick a line, pick a tack, and move in a certain direction, professionally and personally, I think it helps to think about sources of inspiration in terms of individuals who we look up to and in whom we see character traits that we feel should be compiled as we try to formulate our ideal leadership presence. And so, you know, all of us, we have sports heroes, we may have coaches, family members, individuals who we've looked up to, and in our minds, they're characterized by certain character traits, by certain qualities, by certain behaviors. And as I thought about leadership, the first time that I was asked to speak on leadership formally, I was thinking about the individuals who I knew who were famous in radiology and were leaders, and I was trying to think of who had the most profound effect on me as an individual. And it was an unsuspected person. And it took my reflection and my considerable thought about this space to arrive at the destination. When I was a radiology resident in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, between 1987 and 1991, Frank Perrone was a junior attending. He had just turned 40 years old, and he would, part of the time, he'd be on the fluoroscopy rotation. The fluoroscopy rotation at the time consisted of a lot of barium enemas and upper GIs, and not all of the attendings looked forward to it. In fact, they saw it to some degree as a tax they had to pay in order to be able to look at ultrasounds and do what little CT of the abdomen we were doing at the time. But not Frank. When Frank was on, he had an entirely different attitude. First of all, he was cheerful, which was, at the time, unusual for somebody rotating on fluoroscopy. And in every instance, he tried to show us and describe to us what it was that we were doing. Mrs. Brown is here. She has upper GI discomfort. She has a history of ulcers. This is really important for her. We have to look for that ulcer. So he break everything down from the patient perspective about why it was important. And he gave us a sense of purpose. Now, at the time, it would be a resident, who would be me. And there would be a nurse. There would be a darkroom technologist. We all remember those, right? And so all of us performed at a higher level when Frank was there because he gave us a sense of direction and a sense of purpose. And we felt as though we mattered. And, you know, as we talk about physician burnout and as we talk about wellness, I think that's one of the missing pieces, is imbuing a sense of purpose in the individuals whom we work with so that we all can have an elevated vision and we can have an aspirational direction that we move in. So interestingly, Frank wasn't the chair of the department. He didn't have 50 people under his tutelage and under his responsibility stream. It was just a couple of us. But even for the couple of us, he made a big difference in terms of the quality of our life and in terms of the purpose that we saw. And so ever since I gave that first talk on leadership, I've always kind of carried around the concept that Frank, to me, is the ultimate leader. He was the person who, even if he was alone in a room, he had a sense of purpose, he had a sense of direction, and he was able to contextualize what he was doing in terms of the greater good that he was providing to society and to others. And so it's important to think about helpful leadership character traits. And what is it that leaders possess that allows them to be effective leaders? And what Dr. Cannon and I have done is we've each chosen a few leadership traits, and there's going to be some overlap naturally, but we believe that these leadership traits are important and are significant and are worthy of consideration. So think about the leadership character traits in leaders whom you have known, and we would love to hear about that during the discussion period. And by the way, if you have questions that you would like to pose while we are lecturing, feel free to write them down, and we will stop and we will entertain those questions if they're relevant to what we're stating at the time. So, to be an effective leader, I think it all starts with an idea. Everything starts with an idea. So you have to think about what it is that you would like to do or where you'd like to go. And then once you have that idea in mind in terms of, what exactly is the essential need? What is my solution? Well, then you have to generate a vision. Now, it starts with an idea, but it eventually has to migrate to something like a vision. As we all know, the mission for us is what it is we all agree on that we are doing in the moment. That's not necessarily as exciting as the vision. The vision is what's down the road. Where are we headed? What would we like to do? What is that possible future that we can be led to? So it's essential to look to the future and to have a vision that you can crystallize, that you can describe, that you can explain in detail in a manner that others can also pick up on it, be inspired by it, be excited by it, and therefore follow you. So a vision, to be effective, should be inspirational, but it can't just be inspirational. It should be credible as a believable destination. It should be achievable. If it's not achievable, it's not a practical vision, and it won't be inspirational if it's not practical. So a vision is critical, and it starts with an idea. And once you've generated that vision, you should be able to create optimism in others where your leadership is concerned. You have to understand that you can't lead unless you have a vision that is optimistic. Now, you might say that you're in a very challenging situation and the situation is dire, but if you want to lead people out of a dire situation, they have to be led by you to a better future. So the single most important character trait of leaders, in my opinion, is optimism. It's possessing optimism, it's breeding optimism in yourself, it's reinforcing optimism. So it is therefore, in my opinion, the essential and single most important character trait of a leader. But I'm not talking about being a Pollyanna, being happy in every circumstance and situation, no matter how bad it gets. The optimism that I'm describing is the optimism that underlines and catalyzes your vision. If you want people to follow you to a particular destination, they have to believe that you can get them there, and they have to believe that the future, if they follow you, is brighter than if they follow any of the other alternatives they have. So this is not about blind, perpetual optimism. It's the belief in well-founded optimism if your vision is pursued, if your ideas are put into action. And so the vision has to make you optimistic. If the vision doesn't provide an optimistic future, it's not a vision that will be followed effectively. So equally as important as being an optimist is realizing the effect that pessimists have on you. If you surround yourself with pessimists who are continuously sniping and complaining and bellyaching, at some point it's going to make its way into your head. You need to have a balanced understanding. You need to have devil's advocates. You need to have essential dialogue, but you cannot be surrounded by pessimists and losers and expect yourself to reinforce your ability to be an optimistic visionary. Now, if you are optimistic, if you have a vision, if it's been developed from an idea, the other essential need is to be able to communicate it to others. And when you're communicating it to the followers or to others, you have to have a sufficient amount of power and charisma to be able to carry the message, but you have to be articulate. You have to put that vision into words, into believable words that the recipients can understand. And in order to do that, in order to inspire and motivate through communication, you need to understand the language of your followers. You need to understand their educational level, their state of mind, the words that are effective and the words that are ineffective. And that's one of the challenges when we look at contemporary leadership. There's all kinds of jargon that's utilized and tones that are inappropriate that don't effectively engage the followers so that they will want to follow you. So to find the right words, to find the right form and the right content, it's going to take emotional intelligence, which Sherry's going to talk about to a greater degree. The messaging that we engage in, it matters. And the vision that we're promoting has to be terse, has to be concise, crystallized, it has to be consistent. You cannot have a shifting vision. Once you start having a shifting vision, you have indistinctness, and then questions arise in terms of the clarity of your vision. So the messaging necessitates a consistent message, a transmissible message that can be handed from not just you to a person directly, but can be handed from person to person without becoming a version of the telephone game where the message is transformed as it goes down the line. It has to be clear, it has to be self-evident, it has to be transmissible. In order to do that, your vision has to be short and it has to be crisp. It has to be concise. Dr. Cannon is going to speak more on emotional intelligence, but I'd like to just briefly cover a couple of the essential bits of it. To be emotionally intelligent, it means you have to understand how others feel in the moment, and you also have to be able to control your emotional state. What I mean by that in terms of understanding others' frame of mind is you need to have a sufficient level of empathy to know what it is that others are hearing when you are speaking, or what others are experiencing. You have to be able to get out of your body and understand what it's like to be a recipient, but also an objective third party in the room watching the conversation and seeing if this is effective or it's ineffective at achieving the stated goals. So you have to be empathic, you have to be understanding, and there's this whole need for a shifting perspective. And in the management literature, it talks about being on the court while also being on the balcony at the same time. It's not sufficient to fly at 20 or 30,000 feet looking down strategically. If you want to be an effective leader, you need to know what it's like to be in the trench. You need to visualize what it's like to be hearing this message. You need to understand what the challenges are. If you cannot connect the 20,000-foot view to what's happening in the trenches, you cannot effectively lead. And what that demands is empathy and understanding of what it is that others are experiencing as they receive your message. And at the same time, you have to be able to control your own responses. You cannot be quick to anger or quick to excitement. You have to be measured and thoughtful in terms of how you respond in each instance. So with your permission, I'm going to hand it off now to Dr. Cannon.
Thank you, Dr. Norbash. So we're going to continue in the same vein. And as you've noticed, Dr. Norbash and I picked traits that we personally think lead to success in leadership. And I think a very important thing here is it's not one formula fits. There are different approaches, and I think that's important, and we'll talk a little more about that. But the traits that I want to talk about with you now is a take on emotional intelligence and actually translating that to competency, confidence, credibility, and authenticity. So let's pick up where Alex left off. So one of the challenges to all of these traits actually is fear. And Alex mentioned earlier being a fearless leader. So we'll come back to that because I think that's an important concept. So let's talk a little bit about emotional competency. And Alex walked you through a little bit of emotional intelligence. And I think most of us understand the concepts of emotional intelligence. It's self-regulation, knowing our trigger points, how we respond, but then again, shifting to that important empathetic viewpoint so that we can understand and lead those around us. Now that's the concept of emotional intelligence. Now the good thing is we can improve or increase our EQ, unlike IQ, and that's important. And as leaders, one of the things that you have to do is reflect, and it's really a constant reflection of your skills, how you are doing as a leader, and how you are impacting others. And when you really look at the domains of emotional intelligence across self-awareness, self-management, social wellness, and relationship management, you can drill down to specific competencies and really assess yourself and how you're performing in these areas. In this specific article, it talks about leaders who have some emotional competency, but they may have specific areas that are weak for them. So as a leader, you really need to look at these and reflect on these. And I always tell my leadership team, to be a leader, you really need to make sure your house is in order if you're going to lead others. Not only because you're a role model, but because you actually will attract those around you who have similar leadership traits and skills. Now, there is a strong business case for emotional competence. We know that it's linked with improved patient outcomes. There's reduced disruptive behavior on the part of physicians and healthcare workers, and we know the dollar values associated with that in the form of reduced malpractice, also with replacement or loss of physicians. And there are actually studies that show that there are improved health benefits with emotional competence. And in fact, emotional intelligence is probably one of the strongest mitigators against burnout. And Alex mentioned this earlier. In this one specific evaluation of chief medical officers who all reported that their current position was probably the most stressful that they've had in their entire professional career, almost none of these leaders were burned out. And if you looked at the common thread to each was a high EQ. And at the root of that is empathy. If we maintain our empathy and have an understanding of our colleagues, of our patients, then the factors of burnout, that is that detachment piece, may not be quite as prevalent. Now here's an interesting concept in the psychological literature talking about empathy. Because if we talk about emotional competency, we need to improve our empathy, but how do we do that? Well, there are actually ways to do that. And one thing they learned with functional MRI, and actually it was just an accidental experiment that resulted in what they call mirror neurons. So a researcher was actually observing a monkey with functional MRI and noticed specific reactions and firing in the cortex of areas associated with eating, yet the monkey was not eating. But they noticed in the same lab another animal was eating at the same time. And so long story short, they deduced that this monkey was able to truly understand this other animal eating, in some ways adopting that emotional response. So if we are to practice empathy, one of the best ways to do this is not just be a good listener, which we talk about, but really try to understand the mindset of the person with whom you're speaking. Look at their nonverbal cues, look at their emotional state, and actually doing this in a mindful way is an exercise that will actually increase your empathy. Now, an important component of this, though, is to be able to separate yourself, and they talk about this in the social work literature. If social workers are to be effective, they are empathetic, yet if they are not able to separate themselves, then they're at risk for burnout. They have to control their emotional responses. So if there's one thing you take home today, it's that emotional intelligence and then hopefully competency is a physiologic response that responds to exercise so that it becomes habituated. So you don't have to actually think, all right, I need to be nice. I need not to overreact. So let's move on to confidence. And with that, I tie it back to what Alex has already talked about. I think a key part of confidence is having that optimism. And specifically when we talk about women and women in STEM positions, more than half the women who begin in STEM jobs actually remain. Less than half. So what goes on there? Well, if you look, about 1 out of 5 women who are in what is defined as a STEM job, and if they are defined as successful, that is, they self-report job satisfaction, they are considered credible by their colleagues, and they have achieved a position of senior leadership. 1 of 5 of these, the traits they have in common are these following strategies. They demonstrate confidence. That's number 1, and I think that's key. They claim their ideas, are confident in their ideas. They actively develop networks. They actively sponsor others around them, not just women, but men as well. They are authentic, and we'll touch on this in a moment. And they also actively hone their brand. So you have to convey that confidence, that optimism, if you're going to lead others. Credibility, also closely linked with that, and authenticity, and that is clearly linked as well. And I would argue vulnerability. One of the traits that leaders are able to demonstrate at appropriate times are moments of vulnerability. Leaders are not perfect, and I think when their followers understand that, and when leaders have the confidence to express vulnerability, I think that gives them more credibility. They are authentic people. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Alex to share maybe some leadership lessons learned.
Thank you, Dr. Cannon. We thought it would be of value to you if we would talk a little bit about lessons learned in terms of specific examples and why they were important to us as leaders specifically. So it's a leadership conversation, and it also essentially is reduced down to personal leadership and motivational basis. So when you think about lessons learned, you can look at something that's happened and it was either a mistake, which is a painful lesson where something went wrong or you did something wrong. Or it could be a victory where you did something and it actually turned out very well and you never anticipated that it would. But there are also indeterminate events where you're doing something and you're not sure if it was a victory or if it was a failure. What's interesting is using the lens of time and experience. When I look back at things I did 20 years ago, 10 years ago I may have called them successes, and now I would look at them and say I could have done that better. Or vice versa. I might have thought 10 years ago that, oh, you know what, this mistake that I made was terrible, and now I say, no, it wasn't that bad. So there's a dynamic that you're involved in as you have accumulated experience. And you learn to forgive yourself, but you also learn how to take as much as you can in terms of lessons out of each individual experience. So I'd like to share just a few. I had a physician who worked for me. The physician engaged in marginal behavior that wouldn't be acceptable to most of us. The physician underwent a human resources review, and a human resources report came out and stated that the individual needed to go to sensitivity training, but a reprimand was not necessarily in order, nor did anything need to be done that was more significant than that, including there was no need to put a letter in his file. At the time, the person that I worked for stated to me that that individual's existence was undermined, the principle-driven ethic that we were trying to create, and that individual had to leave, and it was left to me to have that person leave. And I dismissed that person as a result of what my superior told me. And I felt bad at the time, but I felt worse later because I felt as though I let that person down. So what I did is the fear of my continued unemployment or employment drove me to do something because I was told to do it, rather than my dragging my heels a little bit as I should have. I put up a little bit of resistance, but it was pathetically inadequate. What I should have done was engage other individuals and should have stood on principle. So what I did is, I'm an individual who always believes in being principle-driven, being process-led. I went against my own principles. I did something that was vicarious simply because I was told to, and I did not stick to the mantra of this is what human resources did. We have a human resources section. I need to kick it up a notch. I need to employ whatever means I can. I need to be a little resistant, and I have to disagree for the right reason and be willing to lose rather than simply going along with what I'm being told to do. So that was a bad lesson. I should not have made that mistake. Another lesson that was a positive lesson. I was called by the CFO of an organization that I worked in. I was told that we needed to save $1 million off of the radiology payroll, and we had to figure out how to do it, and we had a week to figure that out. And so I called an emergency meeting of all the faculty, and I discussed a range of options, several options, and I asked them to internally discuss it, and I'd be there as an advisor, and I wanted to have a consensus opinion. They generated a consensus opinion, which is that we would all take furloughs of 3 weeks each, and we ended up saving the $1 million, and every year after that, we ended up having the option of furloughs, and we maxed out on it, because a lot of people wanted to take the furloughs, even though they weren't being paid for that time. They enjoyed and appreciated the time off. So in that instance, the previous instance was one where I went against my own principles to do what I was told, and I regretted it. This is an instance where I looked at governance, and I allowed the group to govern itself. I took a risk in that instance, and it worked out very, very well. So again, that was a learning experience. That was an opportunity to look at how we solved the problem, recognizing that it came out serendipitously the right way. So this third example is an example of adaptation, and the lack of clarity one has as the landscape continuously shifts. I was put in the position of having to put into place a 24/7 radiology service. And what that meant was it would decrease the work RVUs for the day sections, neuroradiology, musculoskeletal, thoracic, abdominal, everything. And we would have to figure out a way to fund this. And we also had to shift over a couple of individuals from day shifts to night shifts, individuals who had not signed up to do night shifts in perpetuity, but now had expressed some willingness given the boundary conditions. So we were able to utilize input from a number of different individuals to formulate a solution and put into place a 24/7 service. At the time, I thought it was successful, but now, many years later, I realized that there are challenges to the financial structure, and what we could have done is we could have gone into a joint venture with another hospital in the area to take the liability and diversify it rather than assuming the full liability financially and operationally of having to have 24/7 radiology. So I'm not sure if it was a failure, but I don't think it was a success. And I guess only time will tell. I haven't figured it out yet, but I think about it often. And I try to understand, what could have gone better and how would the metrics of success have applied in that particular instance. So I'd like to share with you an observation that I have. The observation is that we are all perpetual students. And we're students of our own past. And we have to reflect and we have to think about what we've done. And we have to continuously, philosophically, contextualize our actions and activities against the best possible outcome. So I think we have to understand that we will always make mistakes, and mistakes are incredibly valuable as long as you treat them properly. As long as you look at them, you examine them, you inspect them, you learn from them. Mistakes that you don't learn from are damaging and tropic and serve no purpose. But every single failure, every mistake is worth its weight in gold, because it's the most transformational opportunity we have to learn. So we have to value mistakes and we have to learn from them. So we will always be students. And that's simply a reality of what we do and who we are. And we also will always be experimentalists. So part of that fearlessness that Sherry talked about is the willingness to forge ahead and realize that if we've made a mistake, we try to minimize the size of the mistake and we try to learn from that. So we have to be students and we have to be experimentalists. So I have a suggested mantra that I would like to apply in this instance. The first part of it is understand how you can inspire others by elevating their performance intentionally. So we have to understand how we can gather together whatever resources we have, use it charisma or what you will, use it a vision, use it communication, but to take the performance of others and to elevate it, because that's our job as leaders. And personal leadership means elevating your own abilities and your own vision. The second thing we have to focus on is learning to understand others, because until we understand them, until we're emotionally intelligent, we can't possibly expect to motivate them. But part of that is understanding them, and part of that is enjoying them and being fascinated by them. And one of the interesting things about leadership is that you run into a whole range of personalities. You can't be polarized by them. You can't like and dislike them. You have to be an investigator, and a fascinated investigator who wants to learn the best avenues to success by tapping into the motivational base for this full range of personalities that we all deal with. And then finally, we have to project optimism. We have to project it, we have to engender it, we have to stoke it. And the way we do that is by having ideas, in communicating visions, and elevating the performance of others through that optimism. I'll hand it off now to Dr. Cannon.
Thank you. So lessons learned, this will ring true and kind of sound familiar. So we all have made the mistakes with email, of course. You shouldn't send out email when you're tired, stressed, or particularly when you're angry. Those are the tough and quick lessons learned. The more serious one, and again, it's going to sound very familiar. I had a very disruptive faculty member some years back. Or that's how I categorized this person, as the disruptive faculty member, and put them in this specific box in my head. And to Alex's point, you have to really think and take a moment to consider perspective of the other person, and perhaps there's a different story. This particular faculty member was disruptive to the point of becoming aggressive and even threatening. And in fact, I had one of my other faculty members leave town with their family for a week to avoid this person for safety reasons, and I had a plainclothes detective in my chair suite. It escalated, and I actually, and this, you can imagine the numbers of lawyers, discussions, etc. And it escalated to the point that I issued a notice of non-renewal of contract, so that's a year notice, but they were escorted off campus at that point. So what was the failure there? Well, in this case, disruptive physician was not because of narcissism or other personality disorder. This was actually really a cry for help, and it was a cry for help that I didn't realize the degree of it. And unfortunately, this physician committed suicide 2 weeks later. And it was really, you know, you go down this pathway, to Alex's point, and you really need to think about your impact that you have with your colleagues and with your partners, and really take a moment to think, why is this person behaving this way? Because in some cases, it's not because they have a personality disorder. It's because there's really an issue at the core of it. Lessons learned with confidence and credibility. Alex mentioned that we are in a constant state of learning, and part of that is reflection and determining your gaps. And as a leader, that should be a continual process. And one thing I learned early on, one of my large areas of really ignorance, because I really had no business training early on, finances. And I knew if I was going to become a leader in a department, I had to have a better grasp of just some basic principles of accounting and finance. And I reached out to my chair at that point, who was very supportive and actually arranged for me to have a series of monthly tutorials with our executive administrator around finance and accounting. And it was probably one of the most beneficial things I've done, and it really speaks to the value of having mentors, particularly who are willing to give back. And also, as an aside, for those of you wanting to get more involved in your health systems and your hospitals, it's really the finance committees that wield most of the power and influence. So I would urge you to seek those out. Let's go back to the disruptive physician, because there was another issue that I had with the disruptive physician that actually I think was handled quite well, because I had a lot of input from a lot of very smart people. But again, at the core of a lot of challenges we have of leaders is fear, and in this case, fear of making the wrong decision, but it's also loneliness. Many times when you're dealing with a disruptive physician, a partner, or a faculty member, you're taking necessary actions, but because of the situation, it's a confidential situation, and others may not see you taking those actions. And in fact, it can be very lonely. You're doing the right thing, but sometimes it takes longer than you expect, and it's done privately. And that's just one of those times when you have to realize that you are doing the right thing and be patient and press on. And finally, authenticity. And I say this specifically as a woman, but it's important for everyone. You really need to be the leader based upon your skill sets, your interest, and you have to be authentic. You can't be something that you're not. And particularly as women, I think sometimes we try to be more assertive, more masculine even. And that's not going to get you the credibility that you need and that you need to be successful. So authenticity is very important. And as you advance your leadership skill sets, I would urge you to really tap into those things that you know you do well and try to advance those even more, shore up some of the gaps. Don't be a leader that you can't be. And with that, I think we can turn it over to some questions if we have any or comments.
Any questions, anyone? I mean, I actually do have a quick question about the disruptive personality that you were talking about, Dr. Cannon. Based on some of your experiences, do you think that there was something that could have been done earlier on, maybe having a conversation with the person or some ways to figure out why they're being so disruptive to prevent it kind of from snowballing to worse situations?
Yeah, I think similar to Alex's experience, I didn't push hard enough. I knew this individual had some mental health issues, and in fact had several discussions with him and referred him on to an evaluation. But I didn't press hard enough, to be honest. And I would say in dealing with all disruptive physicians, don't put off the inevitable. Have the conversation, go ahead and engage early on, because in most cases, it's not going to get better on its own.
So I think this also highlights another area which for me has been a difficult education or a challenging education. Every institution has policies and procedures and methods for different things. So when it comes to disruptive physicians, we have a program. And again, how do I know about this? Because I ended up having a disruptive physician and I had to figure out what to do with him. So I had to figure out that we had a disruptive physician program. I had to figure out what a performance improvement plan consisted of. I had to figure out from legal and from human resources what the process is for engaging in corrective action and setting limits to behavior. The time to do that, ideally, is not when you're in the middle of a pickle and you've got to solve this in the moment. Ideally, you figure this out ahead of time. You ask the necessary questions. You find out who the human resources officers are. You find out what the policies and procedures are. Because ultimately, if you're a leader, this is information that you're going to want to know. Not necessarily because you want to be defensive and not necessarily because you want to be offensive, but if somebody says to you, listen, so-and-so is doing such and such, what is the consequence and what's the method, what's the process, you want to be informed. You want to be able to say, well, if somebody is acting in an abusive manner, this is what we have to do. This is how we engage the necessary oversight. These are what the resources are. So you have to learn about the landscape. You have to learn about the environment. You have to do a reconnaissance, an effective reconnaissance. And unfortunately, we typically do that when we need something emergently in the moment. The time to do that effectively is when you have the luxury of time to reflect and think and write things down and think about how things are assembled. You can be a valuable resource, but you have to take it upon yourself to learn about your system and your environment.
I have a question for you, Dr. Norbash. So if you're in a working environment where you're surrounded by a lot of non-optimistic people, very negative thinkers, do you have any tips for how to keep yourself internally optimistic?
You have to find like-minded individuals who are optimistic. You can't win the battle if you're the only optimistic person who is surrounded by a lot of pessimists. It's difficult to be the sole voice. If you're sufficiently strong and innovative, it's possible you could pull it off, but typically that's fictional, like 12 Angry Men. Usually we are convinced and coerced because we're sociological by those who are around us. So the most important thing is to pick the right environment. If you're interviewing for a position and it pays an incredibly high amount of money, but everybody there is schmoopy, you're not going to be happy there. It is inconceivable that you would be happy there. You have to figure out what people's disposition and composition is like and try to self-aggregate around others who are also optimistic and energized. You can bump up the energy levels for other people, but it helps if you're around others that reinforce your positive character traits. You have to be an observer of human nature, and you have to pick the right spot with the right individuals around you. It's not enough to focus on the job. You have to focus on the framework. You have to focus on the environment. You have to focus on the network.
Yeah, I think that's very true. As a leader, you recruit and you build a culture. And when you build that culture of optimism, when pessimists come into that, they're actually marginalized by the community because they're outliers. And so if you've created the culture, a strong culture, it helps address those individuals.
Mm-hmm. It looks like we have a question from Dr. Weissman. I'm having some difficulty unmuting him now.
Hi, Alex and Sherry. Good evening. I wanted to build upon what Jen said, Alex and Sherry. If you can build your team, you can certainly have a team of more optimistic people, things like that. But what happens if you're in committees and things like that where you can't necessarily build your team? You're kind of put into that situation. You have to be in a situation. What are certain strategies you use to keep yourself moving forward and projecting that positive vision and optimism? Thank you.
You're welcome, Ian. So what I would suggest is I'd suggest that being very explicit and being very obvious and saying things like, well, you know, pessimism is not going to serve us well. We need to be optimistic in the moment. So sometimes you have to be extremely explicit. And what happens is there's a range of pessimism in a group. Now, it may be that there's a preponderant amount of pessimism, but typically you'll find one person who's the most pessimistic, and you're trying to tease over individuals who are kind of on the line or amenable to having your kind of a worldview. But again, I think it's difficult to be one person against the world. You have to find individuals who, if they're not even like-minded, they're at least more similar to you in terms of their thought style than the individuals who are your polar opposites.
Sometimes humor helps in that situation too. Now you have to be a little careful. You don't want to overdo the humor, but I have found that injecting a little humor in committee and boardroom discussions appropriately, and particularly when you're subtly calling out the pessimist, can be pretty effective.
I like that.
Do we have any more questions from our attendees? Okay, so with that, I want to thank everyone for participating in this webinar series tonight. We have a few brief bullet points we wanted to mention before we go. Our next webinar, titled Creating Value, is scheduled for October 24th on a Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will be sending you an email confirmation shortly, so please mark your calendars for the next one. We also will be sending you a post-webinar survey, so please take some time to fill this out and get back to us. We really would appreciate some feedback as we're kind of developing this Power Hour series, so would appreciate anything you could contribute. We also will have a recorded version of this particular webinar that we're going to post around sometime next week. So if you would like to go back and re-review the slides, the topics, we'll have the opportunity to do so. So with that, I guess thanks everyone and have a great evening.
Thank you.